This is the Penn GSE EdCast, where you get perspectives on education and social science from the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Today we're talking to Pedro Noguera, the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University. Dr. Noguera is an urban sociologist who has long studied how social and economic conditions affect urban schools. He was at Penn GSE recently as the keynote speaker for the celebration of our mid-career doctorate program's 10th anniversary, and we got a chance to talk to him about achievement gaps and the challenges that face urban schools. You've been looking at achievement gaps for a while. You've been writing on the social context and the political context of education and educational improvement for a while. We've not been making significant progress in closing achievement gaps, not at least in recent years. And I wanted you to think about that in terms of urban poverty. It seems to me that there's a lot of emphasis, a lot of attention being paid anyway, right attention or wrong attention, I'm interested in your view, on urban educational improvement. But I'm wondering if in your view there's an equal or a healthy amount of attention being paid to the attendant issues of poverty and social context that sort of set the stage for kids who are entering those urban schools in the first place. What are you making of this these days?
I would say that's been one of the big failures of policy in the last 20 years. We basically stopped fighting the war on poverty in the late 1970s. There's a study out of Educational Testing Service entitled, "Why Aren't We Making More Progress?" They asked the question, if you look at the data, the gap in achievement was closing. It was narrowing up until the late 70s, early 80s. And then it plateaued and actually started going the other way. And their argument, when they look at a wide range of data, what could explain that is that essentially it was because we started to increasingly ignore the out-of-school factors that we already knew weighed heavily. Nutrition, family income. These are things that have great bearing on student performance. ETS is known for years. The strongest predictor for how well a student does on the SAT is family income, combined with how much education the parents had. So when you ignore those kinds of variables, when you put all the weight on schools, you end up with schools being more pressured and then schools and educators being blamed for failure, which I think where we are now. I would say that the no excuses movement, which is I think the popular reform movement that's kind of taken hold across the country, has reinforced that idea that poverty is not the issue. The issue is teacher performance. The issue is, and we have to hold teachers accountable. This is the Joel Klein, Michelle Rhee message. And they've even said, Joel has said numerous times, poverty is not the issue. You know, on the one hand, I agree with them because it's very important that we recognize poor kids can achieve, poor kids can learn. Poverty is not a learning disability. At the same time, it can be an obstacle. And if you don't find ways to address those obstacles, then poor kids tend not to do so well.
So hypothetically, then, you are a big fan of a kind of Harlem Children's Zone Promise Neighborhood approach to educational improvement and a not so big fan of Race to the Top.
Yes. And what's interesting about that, in fact, we're doing that kind of work, similar to the Harlem Children's Zone in Newark right now, with 7 schools in Newark, and we're getting really good results. I'm associated with a group that put forward what we call a broader and bolder approach to reform. And we argued this because we knew No Child Left Behind was being reauthorized, and we said there needs to be at least 3 things done differently. First, we need to make sure we have universal access to preschool, because all the research has shown for years that if you start during infancy, it will benefit a child throughout their life. Second, we have to focus on health, because we have...
Don't Head Start gains start tapering off?
They do, but you have to focus on quality throughout. It's not just preschool. So if you do good preschool, then you put them into bad elementary schools, it will taper off, right? So you can't settle for preschool. We have to get away from the idea that there's just, if you just do one thing, everything will work out. It never works like that. So preschool by itself absolutely will not produce the changes we want, but it's certainly an important piece of the puzzle. The other part is extended learning, quality summer, quality after-school programs, which middle-class kids get typically, but poor kids often don't. Now, we put this out as a statement. Myself, Tom Pizant, the former superintendent of Boston, Helen Ladd, an economist at Duke are the 3 co-chairs, and we got lots of people to co-sign, endorse this. That included superintendents, academics, policymakers from a variety of fields, one of whom was Arne Duncan, while he was still superintendent of Chicago. He signed on and said, yeah, I agree with that. Right after we put out our statement, another group led by Joel Klein, Newt Gingrich, and Al Sharpton, came out with the kind of no excuses manifesto, saying, no, it's about accountability, it's not about those other things, it's about holding schools accountable for student performance. And what was interesting about their manifesto, it was also endorsed by a group called Democrats for Education Reform, and it had a lot of money behind it, because the big foundations, Walton, Gates, Broad, all kind of lined up. And so there's this debate that's been going on across the country. And what's interesting is the administration, and Arne Duncan in particular, has tried to straddle between the two. So they have done promised neighborhoods. But I would say, if you look at Race for the Top, it's very much in that no excuses orbit, right? That is that most of what's being pushed out there is about judging schools and kids very narrowly by high-stakes tests and not addressing these other issues.
Here's the benevolent dictator question, right? You're the benevolent dictator. What else are you doing in addition to Race to the Top? I mean, promised neighborhoods really haven't had a chance outside of Harlem.
They got unfunded by Congress, so it hasn't been the initiative that I think President Obama would have liked. And I want to give them credit. The administration put money, stimulus funds, into Race for the Top at a time when districts were desperate for funds. So that's a good thing, to put more money. Problem is, and then they targeted the chronically failing schools and said, those schools have to be turned around. Except they gave no guidance at all. In fact, they did worse than gave no guidance. They prescribed the turnaround strategy. Fire the principal, fire half the teachers. Why wouldn't they say, first, go in and figure out why the school's failing? Figure it out. Is it failing because there are poor teachers or because the principal? Then certainly, then make the tough decision. But if it's failing because the school is overwhelmed by the high needs, many of these schools, I would argue, that have been labeled failures, were designed to fail. They are overpopulated by high-need kids and under-resourced and understaffed. And unless you change that scenario, they will continue to fail.
I've not really seen a great balanced discourse that was honest between people who are mostly into accountability and sort of no excuses camp and folks who are pointing to larger social issues than that and the extant problems beyond schools that affect the chances of urban youth. And it's a really hard conversation to moderate well. And there's so many different entangled issues. I mean, have you seen it done well?
Well, not really. No, I haven't. The debate is very polarized. It's highly partisan. And I would say, honestly, the truth is always in this very complex middle than it is on either end of the spectrum. For example, charter schools. I support charter schools. I'm a trustee for the State University of New York. We authorize charter schools. I chair that committee. So I get to see the proposals. We get to approve those charters, and the state then locates them. I will also admit right away that many of the charter schools should have been shut down. They're not even as good as the public schools. Many of the ones that are good are screening out the hard-to-serve kids, the special needs kids, the English language learners. Many of the best charter schools have a lot more money because Goldman Sachs and the hedge funds like them, so they're throwing money at these schools. And so we're comparing charter schools to public schools in many places and seeing the charter as a savior and not recognizing that it's not a level playing field. And that when those charter schools push out or counsel out the hard-to-serve kids, they end up back in the public schools. And the public schools are then, again, overpopulated by a disproportionate number of high-need students. And that's what we're seeing in cities across the country now that are promoting charters as the alternative.
Yeah. So what I want you to do now is put on a hopeful, optimistic, and non-deficit model demeanor and tell me why I should be hopeful that there's going to be significant progress made on closing achievement gaps, especially in urban settings, or achievement gaps, in America in my lifetime.
I'm not that naive to think that that's necessarily the case. I would say this, though, that there are enough schools. I mentioned Brockton High School a little while ago. Central High School in Newark, as another school I mentioned, where we're seeing gains. We've taken the approach that if we respond to those broader non-academic needs and focus like a laser on high-quality instruction, that we could actually move a school forward. And we're seeing it happen at Central High School. And we're hoping the other 6 feeder schools that feed into Central will also see improvement. So my hope is that if we can get more schools to learn from examples of success, and success is out there, that if we can get policy to learn from success and to reinforce it, that we could actually get a lot more progress than we are getting right now. The best example of scalability and replicating success comes from KIPP. I'm a fan of KIPP. KIPP is very much in the no excuses camp. I have had a relationship with KIPP for several years now, working with their Leadership Institute, which is held at NYU. They're very thorough. They're very focused on outcomes. They're very focused on quality instruction. They're really focused on preparing leaders to be effective at managing schools. And they're showing that even in very tough communities, they can create good schools. They're not as good as sometimes people claim, and they also have their issues, but they're pretty consistently better than the public schools in the neighborhoods that are serving similar populations of kids.
What about the assessment part?
Well, the assessment part is essential. I think what we've got to do, it helps. I want to give the administration credit for the Common Core standards. Now it will help if we develop assessments that correspond to those standards and that do ensure our kids are reasoning and problem solving and have the critical thinking and writing well. So assessment is important as long as we're using it appropriately. We should be using it to gauge progress, and we should be using it to diagnose learning needs, which means that we've got to get the results of those tests back to teachers in a much more timely manner than we do now. Typically right now, we test the kids in the spring, we give the teachers the results in the fall when they no longer have the students, which means that the idea of using the assessment to give teachers information about their student needs is largely not possible.
Well, Pedro Noguera, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
The Penn GSE EdCast is a production of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, and it's produced by me with help from John Wallace and technical direction from Kaja Novatsky. Pedro Noguera has a book coming out this month titled Creating the Opportunity to Learn, Moving from Research to Practice to Close the Achievement Gap, and it's published by ASCD. Thanks for downloading.